The world had just emerged from the deepest shadow it had ever known. In 1945, when the guns fell silent and the fires of war dimmed, millions of men wandered through the ashes of a broken century. Among them were the defeated soldiers of the Empire of Japan, men who had once believed in the divinity of their emperor, the sanctity of obedience, and the unshakable order of a world where men fought and women waited. They came from islands of silence, from places where the war had taken everything except the memory of how things used to be. And when they surrendered, they carried not only their uniforms and their hunger, but the remnants of a belief system that had shaped generations. In their eyes, America was a myth, a land of impossible machines, boundless wealth, and alien values. They had been told the Americans were monsters, that their women were corrupt, their men cowardly. And now, as prisoners of war, these same men would see that myth take shape before them, and unravel in ways they could never have imagined. The camps that held them were far from home, from the deserts of Arizona to the rolling plains of Kansas, from the damp forests of Oregon to the farmlands of Iowa. Barbed wire divided them from the world, yet through that thin line of steel, they could glimpse another universe entirely, one that moved with noise and purpose and an energy unlike anything they had known. Every morning they heard the distant hum, the growl of engines, the ringing of hammers, the whir of machines. And sometimes, when the wind was right, they could hear laughter, light, unguarded, almost musical. For the men behind the wire, that sound was both haunting and incomprehensible. Women's laughter, free, unhidden, echoing from a place where labor was not duty but choice. In Japan, the war had been a man's world. Women had served the empire quietly, bound by the traditions of home and obedience. They cooked, sewed, and waited. To imagine them at the heart of war production, shaping steel, driving trucks, building bombers, was not just unfamiliar, it was unthinkable. But America, in 1944, was a land transformed by necessity. More than 6 million women had entered the workforce, stepping into the factories and shipyards where men once stood. They wore overalls, tied scarves around their hair, and called themselves by a name that would echo through history, Rosie the Riveter. They were young, middle-aged, married, widowed. Some had sons in uniform. Others had lost them in the Pacific. Yet here they were, side by side, feeding the same machines that built the weapons of their grief. To the Japanese prisoners, this was a sight beyond logic. They watched as women operated cranes, welded metal, and assembled aircraft engines with hands that, in their world, were meant for quiet domesticity. The contrast was jarring, almost violent, like seeing the world turned upside down. The guards who escorted them to work detail seemed unbothered. The women waved, sometimes smiled, and went about their business. And the Japanese men, trained to avert their gaze in the presence of women, found themselves staring, not out of disrespect, but disbelief. What they saw was not merely a different kind of labor, it was a different kind of freedom, a civilization where women walked unescorted, spoke without hesitation, and moved with a confidence that came from knowing their worth. In those moments, behind the fences of a foreign land, many prisoners began to question not just who had won the war, but why. They wondered if defeat was only a matter of arms or something deeper. Had they lost because America possessed more factories, more ships, more bombs? Or because it had something Japan had never dared to imagine? A society that allowed its women to share in its strength. For men raised in the iron hierarchy of the imperial code, this was a revelation more shattering than the surrender itself. Still, it was not easy to accept. In the evenings, as the light faded and the guards led them back through the gates, the men whispered among themselves. Some refused to believe what they had seen. They insisted the women were actors, posing for propaganda. Others said it was shameful, a sign of moral decay, of a civilization that had sacrificed dignity for efficiency. But a few, the quiet ones, said nothing at all. They had seen enough to know the truth. The world they thought they understood had already vanished. In diaries that survived the war, some Japanese POWs described these early days of captivity with a mixture of astonishment and humility. They wrote of the factories that stretched for miles, of women whose faces were smeared with grease but whose laughter carried like music. They wrote of kindness, of American farmers who shared cigarettes, of guards who spoke softly, of the strange courtesy of a nation they had been taught to despise. And woven through those lines was a recurring note of disbelief, almost awe, at the power and humanity of the people who had defeated them. For them, this was not just captivity, it was confrontation with an idea that strength could coexist with compassion, that progress could come not from obedience, but from opportunity, and that a nation's resilience could rest, not solely in the hands of men, but in the shared labor of its people, all of them. Yet beneath that quiet revelation, another truth stirred, one harder to face. If American women could build bombers and engines, then the war they fought had not been merely against soldiers, but against the very spirit of the empire itself. The realization was slow, painful, and deeply personal. It meant that the world they had fought to preserve, the old order of loyalty, duty, and male dominion, was dying, and that its funeral had already begun. Not in Tokyo or Hiroshima, but in the roar of a factory floor half a world away. The winds of post-war change were already rising. Soon, the prisoners would be sent home, carrying stories their countrymen could scarcely believe. Stories of women who worked like men, of freedom worn like a uniform, of an America whose power lay not only in its weapons, but in its will. Some would speak of it. Others would bury it deep, as one buries a dangerous dream. But none would ever forget the sight of a young woman in denim and oil, standing at a machine, shaping the future with her own hands. They had gone to war believing the world was fixed in order and meaning. They returned knowing it could change, and that it already had. But that revelation, that quiet collision between two civilizations, two ways of seeing, was only the beginning. Because what those men would learn in the years that followed would test everything they thought they knew about power, about honor, and about the human heart. When the transport trains carried them inland, away from the coast and the smell of the Pacific, the Japanese prisoners of war did not know what awaited them. They had surrendered, expecting humiliation, chains, starvation, cruelty. That was what they had been told to expect from the Americans. But as the days passed, and the train clattered through endless plains of gold and green, they began to realize that captivity in this strange, vast country would be something else entirely. The camps that held them were built with a quiet precision, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers watching from a distance. Yet the air there felt different. There was space, open skies that stretched to infinity, a kind of freedom that even fences could not contain. The guards were young, polite, sometimes awkward. They called the prisoners boys instead of enemies. They gave them food, let them write letters home, even paid them a few cents for labor. To men raised under the code of Bushido, it was confusing. Mercy was weakness, defeat was shame. Yet here, mercy was policy, and kindness, a way of life. At first, the work details were simple: clearing fields, repairing roads, harvesting crops. But as the months went by, some prisoners were sent to local factories to help fill the labor shortages that still lingered after the war. It was there, in the heart of America's industrial engine, that they saw it again. The thing that had unsettled them from the beginning: women working. Everywhere. They wore denim trousers, gloves, bandanas, and smiles that seemed unbothered by the grime of machinery. They drove forklifts, operated lathes, welded parts for airplanes and vehicles. Some sang as they worked, their voices rising above the metallic rhythm of production lines. And when the Japanese men entered those spaces, shy, uncertain, watchful, the women barely looked up. They simply kept working, side by side, as if nothing about the situation was extraordinary at all. To the prisoners, it was nothing short of a revelation. In Japan, women had been the quiet backbone of the household, invisible yet indispensable. Here, they were visible, loud, and central, not in the home, but in the nation's public heart. A few POWs whispered among themselves that perhaps this, more than the bombs, was what had won the war, a people who had learned to share their strength. One man, a former naval mechanic named Saito, wrote in his diary, "They laugh while they work. They do not bow. They do not ask permission. They speak to men as equals. It is strange, but I feel no shame in seeing it. Perhaps this is what freedom looks like, when people no longer fear their place in the world." Others reacted differently. For some, the sight tore at the foundations of who they were. How could a civilization so careless with hierarchy have defeated an empire built upon it? How could a woman who smiled and sang while welding be stronger than a man who had given his life to the emperor? The dissonance became a quiet torment, an internal conflict that no command or ideology could reconcile. The war had been fought with the certainty of righteousness, yet defeat had forced them to confront a question far more dangerous than any weapon. What if we were wrong? By the winter of 1945, many POWs had settled into a strange rhythm of existence. They worked, ate, and slept under the gaze of guards who no longer seemed like enemies. They wrote letters home, not to boast of honor, but to speak of astonishment. They described America's abundance, the generosity of its people, and above all, the women. Some camps even hosted small exchanges. Local women would visit, bringing food, books, and sometimes just curiosity. They asked the prisoners about Japan, about their families, their lives before the war. And the men, hesitant at first, began to answer. Through broken English and gestures, fragments of humanity began to cross the barbed wire. A few women even taught them simple phrases. Good morning. Thank you. Be careful. Small words, but they carried the weight of peace. It was through such moments that the image of the enemy began to dissolve. These were not monsters, nor savages. They were people, farmers, mechanics, sons, who had simply been born on the other side of a vast misunderstanding. And the women, who had once symbolized the enemy's strange modernity, began to embody something else entirely: forgiveness. There are accounts of prisoners who wept silently when they received kindness. It wasn't the kindness itself that broke them, but the realization that it was possible, that mercy could exist after everything they had done and seen. Still, not all men adapted easily. Some held fast to the old codes, retreating into silence and shame. One officer refused to eat food prepared by women. Another tore up the work gloves handed to him, declaring that men's hands should not do women's labor. But even they could not entirely shield themselves from what they witnessed each day. Slowly, the cracks appeared, small shifts in thought, barely spoken, but deeply felt. As months turned to years, repatriation began. The war crimes trials were underway, and Japan itself was transforming under occupation. News from home trickled into the camps. The emperor had spoken, as a man, not a god. The cities lay in ruins, and women, in the absence of fathers, brothers, and sons, had taken up new roles: teachers, laborers, even politicians. The very sight that had once seemed impossible was now becoming reality in Japan itself. Many POWs would later recall that realization as the moment their defeat became complete, but also, paradoxically, when their hope began. Because if the world could change this much, perhaps they could too. When they finally returned home, they brought more than scars and memories. They carried questions, dangerous ones. What kind of nation would rise from the ashes? Could Japan rebuild without returning to the chains of its old traditions? And what place would women hold in that rebirth? For some, those questions were too heavy to ask aloud. They blended back into the rhythms of ordinary life, silent about what they had seen. But others, teachers, thinkers, writers, began to plant the seeds of reflection. They spoke of dignity without domination, of strength without cruelty. They spoke of the America they had seen not as a conqueror, but as a mirror, showing them what they might one day become. In later decades, when Japan rose again as an industrial power, the irony was not lost on those who remembered the camps. The same factories, the same machinery, the same hum of production. But now, women stood among the ranks, not as curiosities, but as equals. It was as if history had folded in on itself. The vision once unthinkable to prisoners, now woven into the fabric of their society. Yet beneath this triumph lay a quiet melancholy. For those who had lived through the war, progress always carried the ghost of memory. Every factory whistle, every working woman, every symbol of modernity whispered of the day when defeat had opened their eyes. They had seen the future once, through barbed wire, and it had looked like freedom. As the narrator's voice would soften, the scene might fade to black, a slow dissolve from the faces of young Japanese men behind wire to the faces of American women beside furnaces and machines. Two worlds that had clashed in blood, now bound by something deeper than victory or loss, by the shared labor of survival. Because in the end, history is not written by those who win, but by those who learn. And these men, once warriors of an empire, had become witnesses to the quiet revolution of humanity that unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the factory floor, in the laughter of women who refused to be invisible. In the ruins of war, amidst the steel and smoke, the world was beginning to change. And in that change, the defeated began to glimpse the first fragile outlines of redemption. There are moments in history when the noise of war fades, but its echoes never truly disappear. When the world rebuilds, and men return home, and nations learn to breathe again, the silence that follows is not peace, but remembrance. For the Japanese prisoners of war who once looked across the fences of America and saw women at work, that silence carried a weight beyond words. It was the sound of a world rearranging itself, quietly, irrevocably. Years passed. The camps were dismantled. The men went home. They stepped off the ships into a Japan that felt both familiar and unrecognizable. The cities were dust. The emperor's voice had been heard by the people for the first time. Fragile, human, stripped of divinity. The war that had consumed their youth was now a memory their nation struggled to speak of. And yet, beneath the rubble and the hunger, something had begun to grow. It was faint at first, the sound of factories stirring to life, the hum of sewing machines, the chatter of women returning to work. A new Japan was being born, not from conquest, but from necessity, and from the quiet lessons of defeat. Many of the returning prisoners carried those lessons within them. They had seen a different kind of strength, not the iron discipline of soldiers, but the resilience of ordinary people, of women who turned grief into motion, despair into purpose. They had learned that victory was not simply about power, but about the will to rebuild without hatred. Some spoke of it openly, others never found the words. But in the lives they built afterward, in the factories, the schools, the homes, the influence lingered. They treated their daughters differently, taught them to learn, to question, to dream. And though Japan's post-war years were hard and humbling, the image of the American women they once saw through barbed wire became, for many, a quiet symbol of what the future might hold. By the 1960s, Japan had become an industrial powerhouse, its cities glowing with neon, its workers shaping cars and technology that would circle the globe. The war was a ghost, fading slowly, but its lessons had taken root in ways unseen. In offices and assembly lines, women stood beside men, contributing to a miracle of recovery that stunned the world. It was as if the vision once impossible, women as the hands and heart of progress, had finally crossed the ocean in reverse, finding a home in the very nation that once could not imagine it. But progress carries its own shadows. Even as prosperity grew, the memories of war lingered like faint scars beneath the skin of a nation. For some of those former prisoners, old age brought reflection, and with it, a kind of quiet gratitude. Not for the war, nor for captivity, but for the strange and unexpected humanity they had encountered when they least expected it. In their memoirs, in the fading ink of their journals, they spoke of the faces they remembered. A woman with grease on her hands, laughing as she fixed an engine. A guard who shared a cigarette and said nothing. A farmer's wife who left an apple by the fence. Small moments, but in war, it is the small mercies that become immortal. And the world of today seems impossibly distant from theirs. The lines between enemy and ally have blurred into history books. The roar of factories has been replaced by the hum of machines, no longer bound by gender. And yet, if you look closely, the thread remains. The same thread that wound its way through those years of captivity, through the wire and the fear and the awakening. It is the thread of understanding, fragile, invisible, but strong enough to bind even former enemies in a shared humanity. When we speak of war, we often speak of numbers, battles, losses, victories. But history, in its deepest sense, is not a ledger of destruction. It is a record of what survives in the human heart when everything else is gone. And in that sense, the story of those Japanese POWs is not one of defeat, but of discovery. They came to America as prisoners, stripped of pride, prepared to be despised. Instead, they witnessed something that would challenge their very idea of civilization. They saw a nation that entrusted its women with power, not as decoration, but as necessity. They saw compassion wielded with strength, and strength tempered with grace. And in that vision, they glimpsed what war could not destroy, the boundless adaptability of the human spirit. In the decades that followed, few spoke openly of that time. The memories were too strange, too tender, too entangled with shame. But history has a way of keeping what matters. In archives and forgotten letters, in quiet interviews with men now bent and grey. Fragments of the story endure, of disbelief that turned into respect, of fear that turned into understanding. One former POW, interviewed late in life, was asked what he remembered most about his time in captivity. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I remember the sound," he said, "the sound of women working. It was the sound of a nation stronger than we imagined. It was the sound of peace being built, even before the war was over." Perhaps that is what remains, after all the battles and treaties and monuments fade. The sounds, the gestures, the simple truths that bridge the gulf between enemies. For in every war, beyond the flags and the uniforms, there are moments that remind us what it means to be human. A shared glance, a gift of bread, a smile from across the wire. Those moments do not make war noble, but they make peace possible. And so, as the years stretch on, and the survivors pass into memory, the story endures, not as an account of victory or defeat, but as a quiet testimony to transformation. It tells us that even in captivity, one can learn freedom, that even in loss, one can find meaning, and that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with weapons or speeches, but with the simple act of seeing the world and each other differently. And the camera would fade, perhaps, on the image of an empty factory floor, silent now, but bathed in soft light. A scarf hangs from a nail, untouched. The echo of machines lingers faintly in the air, like a heartbeat remembered. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the world continues, loud, changing, alive. But in that silence, in that stillness, the memory remains, the prisoners who saw freedom for the first time in the hands of those they were taught to underestimate. History moves on, nations heal, time buries its dead, but memory endures. Because the truth they discovered, through wire and work and wonder, is one that transcends every war, that strength has no gender, that dignity belongs to all, and that sometimes the victors are not the ones who conquer, but the ones who learn.